I know. I haven't made a video in like an actual month. And I'm bummed about it as well. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm in fact not in Boston, as this would indicate, but I'm in Baltimore. Anyways, there's been so much work to do over the last month that I have seen almost nothing since we last checked out on the A24 videos. And that's so depressing. I literally saw The Fall Guy, and I think that's it. But that's not what you came here to hear about, was it? You came back for week 5 of the A24 series. Actually, crazy lineup this week. You've got Laggies, which I am super fond of. This is not my first watch, but I'm so delighted that I got back around to rewatching it. It was such a treat, but we'll get into that later. Next, we have Revenge of the Green Dragon. I was not familiar with this film at all before I was doing this series, so this was a completely fresh take for me. And last but not least, we have The Captive, starring Ryan Reynolds. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, it's probably been at least 3 weeks since I watched these movies, so this is gonna be a real testament to what remains after watching them. I, of course, have notes that I took as usual, just sort of like overarching things that stuck with me. But this is going to definitely test the films in what lingers behind after a watch. So let's get into it. Like I said, first up we have Laggies. Laggies was directed by the late filmmaker Lynn Shelton, who I primarily was familiar with because of Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, which I loved. I was devastated when it got canceled. I think that show was phenomenal, and I need more of it. Unfortunately, my prayers are not going to be answered this time, it seems. Anyways, Laggies stars Keira Knightley, Sam Rockwell, and Chloe Grace Moretz. An incredible trio, first off. The chemistry is off the charts. This film is really all about growing up and what it's like to feel stuck in life. There are a lot of in-between periods of life I've found. I know both I and a lot of my friends have felt it recently, kind of in our early to late 20s. I think as you grow up, there's a fear of getting older and really having to determine an adult path for yourself. It's a scary thing to do. It feels like you have to leave behind all the joys of childhood, and you have to kind of release some of the comforts of life that really don't serve you anymore. And that's a really scary thing to do. Sometimes it's really easier to stay in old patterns that are comforting, but not progressing your life very much. Herein lies the problem. We find Keira Knightley's character in a long relationship. I believe she's 28 in the film, somewhere around that age. And she's still with her high school boyfriend. She doesn't know what she's doing with her life. She doesn't have a career. She's clearly intelligent, but she's feeling lost. She's stuck in a place of her life while she is watching all of her friends sort of grow up around her. They're getting married, finding their careers, moving forward, making huge decisions, while she's paralyzed and doesn't really know what next steps to take for herself that will make her happy. These scenes with her friends are actually really great. There's some incredible cameos throughout the film. Ellie Kemper plays a sort of straight-laced, very serious character, which is kind of not what we usually get from her. It's a nice little cameo. It's short, but it's a funny little tidbit of the film if you watch. It's also super refreshing to see Keira Knightley in a sort of crude, unrelentingly funny and sort of darkly comic role, because I think we're used to seeing her in a sort of buttoned up fashion. She of course had a streak over time doing beautiful period pieces, some of my favorites between Pride and Prejudice, Anna Karenina, and then the whole series of Pirates of the Caribbean movies. What we see Keira Knightley in most of the time are these restrained, elegant, calm, collected period piece characters. So it's just a really nice change to see her do something kind of the opposite of that. When Keira's character goes to one of her best friend's weddings and her boyfriend decides to propose to her on that same evening, she freaks out, flees, and accidentally meets Chloe Grace Moretz's character. She stumbles upon these high school students in a grocery parking lot, and they ask her to buy them booze, and being the super responsible adult she is, she does it. If it wasn't clear enough how sort of stunted she's feeling in her life at this point, it becomes extremely clear when she connects really well with these high school students and actually begins to love hanging out with them. She decides she needs a place to crash and ends up staying at Chloe Grace Moretz's house and ends up meeting her father, played by Sam Rockwell. Don't get me started. Sam Rockwell is the most charming to boot, lovely, hysterical, incredible actor. He is one of the finest of our generation, and I've had a crush on him for at least 10 years, and I can't get over it. Sam's character is a single parent to Chloe in this film, and he's recklessly charming and finds an incredible chemistry with Kira's character. Though they're in totally different points of their life, Kira, like a 28-year-old kind of stunted growth, basically teenager, and he's a middle-aged divorced single parent, they find connection in the middle that actually helps both of them, I think. They find ease with each other that is so delightful to watch on screen. It's chemistry like I feel like we rarely see. This isn't necessarily a romantic comedy, but it has an element of that. And if we called it squarely a romantic comedy, I'd say it's one of the best of the last 15 years, maybe. Probably controversial opinion, but I feel it. As Kira sticks around in their house and escapes her regular life, which she's kind of hiding out away from for a little while, she becomes a sort of mentor to Chloe's character. It's interesting because they're both in these confusing points in their life. Chloe Grace Moretz's character is 16. She's in high school. And as anyone who's that age or has been that age, if you're not yet, you'll find out, it's very complicated. It's confusing. It's hard to figure out who you are when you're 16 for a number of reasons. You're in high school. You're not even fully physically grown as a person. Your brain is certainly not finished developing. And the social expectations and drama of high school are staggering. Put that up with a 28-year-old who doesn't know what she's doing, misses the golden age of high school for her, and honestly, it turns out to be sort of a better mentoring experience than you'd expect. I think what it took for Kira's character to realize that she has been stuck in the same place for so long is to actually spend time with these high schoolers. She can enjoy hanging out with them and the sort of lack of responsibility needed in their lives, but at a certain point you realize you don't want to be 16 forever. It's fun for a few days, but at a certain point, you miss the freedom that comes with being an adult. In this beautiful way, the kids and the adults learn from each other. It works both ways. It's a beautiful story of heartbreak, family, feeling stuck in your life and not knowing what to do or where to go, and living the life that you're meant to lead. There's a sort of beautiful message, I think, in this film that smart people get stuck to. It is not emblematic of your worth or value to feel that you don't know what you're doing sometimes. Everyone gets lost. Everyone gets stuck. You can always pull yourself out of that hole. Sometimes it takes meeting a new person that is able to show you new perspective. Sometimes it takes big change. Sometimes it takes tiny change, even mindset change. But getting stuck is not emblematic of your worth. Though I feel like I was sort of rambling just talking about the vibes of this movie, I would strongly recommend it. This is one of my favorite movies I've watched in a long, long time. If for nothing else, watch it for the chemistry of Sam Rockwell and Keira Knightley. It has also, I'm gonna blush, perhaps one of the best movie kisses I've seen in my life. Slightly embarrassed to say that on the internet, but it's all right. This movie is so romantic because it's not about the romance either. It's about living a life and finding out who you are. I always think romance best comes through in a film that's not about one thing. So a film about growing up can have some of the most romantic moments because it's not focusing or trying to make you feel one thing, in my opinion. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I feel. 2 thumbs up. I would gladly recommend this, and I would urge you to watch it soon. I think it's a real sleeper. It makes me think of The Way, Way Back, which is another sleeper hit for me. One of my favorite movies of all time. It's definitely a comfort movie. If you like Sam Rockwell's work in that, or just sort of the general comedy, I think you're gonna love Laggies. And if you haven't seen either of those, watch them both. I don't think you'll be disappointed. They're both very feel-good movies. Next up, Revenge of the Green Dragons. Now, I'm surprised to say I was completely unfamiliar with this film before I came upon it through this series. It sort of makes sense because this movie is about gangs in New York in the 80s, made up mainly of Chinese immigrants. I particularly do not care for mafia or gang movies. I don't have a good reason for it. It's just not something that particularly interests me. So that makes sense why I wouldn't have come across this movie before. However, I will say this one grabbed my interest stronger than a lot of them do. I was shocked that I wasn't familiar with this movie because as the beginning credits rolled, I realized it was produced by Martin Scorsese. Ray Liotta is in the film. Harry Shum Jr. from Glee. Back your memories, they're no good to me. If anything, I know about that. I wash my hands of it. I grew up in theater. That's a whole different story. This is a brutal story based on real events. It's based on an article, actually. It's about these Chinese immigrants coming to New York in the 80s, and through horrible circumstance and really no help from anyone around them, they find themselves in a position where a lot of these young men are being pushed into gangs. This is a harsh, brutal story in every way. If you're sensitive to severe material in really any category, be careful with this film. It doesn't pull punches. We watch as these young boys come to the US and struggle with the culture shock of coming to New York. They're treated so poorly, thrown around from family to family often even, which our lead character has happened to him. It's actually Eric from Twilight. He's really good.
She's really good.
Though I'm not particularly adept with politics, I felt that this film kind of mirrored in a strange way the immigrant policy of Reagan to sort of the Trump era immigrant policies now. They're both so severe and look down on immigrants so much that it casts a really negative shadow from the social culture in New York towards these people. It's really difficult to watch. You watch brutality from every angle raining down upon these people who've just moved to New York just to find a better life for themselves. Now, what's interesting about this film for me as a viewer is that this is completely uncharted territory. This is not a story I had any familiarity with. I don't have any personal understanding of what it's like to immigrate to another country and have the culture shock of that. And I know extremely little about gang culture and especially what was going on in the 80s, as I wasn't alive. This does feel like a Scorsese film with sort of a different flair in some ways. The closest thing I can compare it to that I have watched in the past that's not really a gang film is the brutality and gore feels similar to Man on Fire that stars Denzel Washington, which I watched as a kid. It is unrelenting and horrifying. I repeatedly was taking out my earbuds so I didn't have to listen to gore sounds. Anyways, we watch as these characters grow up in this gang and they become more and more jaded, maybe you could call it, and pushed into worse situations, even pushed to the point where they have to kill people very callously. We watch what happens when people are pushed out of society and they are shown no compassion and no care from any angle. What it looks like when, like there still is, such intense racism in the justice system. There's this horrible, disgustingly dark comedic moment. Comedic makes it sound positive. I don't mean to at all, it's horrible. But it's a dark moment where Ray Liotta is eating Chinese food out of a takeout counter while talking about the best strategy to detain the Chinese people in the neighborhood. This is a horrifically sad and disturbing watch. We watch as children are abused and pushed to the limits, asked to do things that no child should ever have to even think about, and certainly not be a part of. I feel like it sort of begs the question, is the American dream, or was the American dream ever real? There is a repeated theme of Bo Ying, which in the story means what goes around comes around. We watch as the violence and terror is inflicted upon these people, then they in turn inflict it on others, and it makes sort of this vicious cycle of horror, abuse, and violence just keep turning round and round, and it really stomps these poor people into a powerless place. I think one of the big questions about this movie that it begs is, what would you do for power and standing? It also begs the question, how far do you have to push people before they practically implode and do things that no person should ever be involved with because they've been pushed beyond the line? While this movie isn't necessarily the kind of film that I would necessarily watch, I'm glad I watched it. It gave me some new perspective on both what marginalized communities looked like in the 80s in New York, the issues with immigration policy, what the justice system is failing at this time period, and it just urges compassion, I think. I think if you like gang movies, mob movies that are based in violence and a heavy sort of weighted negative feeling, I don't know that anyone likes that, but if that's something you connect with, this might be a film that you enjoy or connect with a little more. While I don't necessarily personally recommend this depending on who I'm talking to, it is overarchingly well acted. It seems to be directed with strong intention, and it has a great team behind it. So I think it's worth watching if it sounds like something that's up your alley. Last up, we have The Captive, starring Ryan Reynolds. This is a pretty straightforward kidnapping mystery thriller movie. We see Ryan Reynolds in, for one of the few times I feel like I've seen him, in a more serious role, which he does pretty well at. Looking back at my notes, my first thought when I was watching this film was, why do they use Arial font in iMovie transitions? Don't really have much more to say about that. It just started off the movie really weirdly with the opening credits. Anyways, right off the bat, we get sort of a cliche look at this kidnapping ring. I wrote, strolling around the house while listening to opera with a tiny mustache means you're either John Waters or a serial killer and there's no in between. Honestly, I'm pretty impressed with that note still. Basically, in this story, Ryan Reynolds' daughter is kidnapped as a child, and it breaks up his marriage. They struggle for years after, searching for her with really no leads. There's very little left behind that they're able to go off of, and it plays out pretty much exactly as you'd expect it to. It's a classic thriller mystery. We see both the side of the detectives who are searching for her over the years, and we see the parents' side. It can be difficult to watch, especially the sections where you're seeing the parents really struggle over their loss and you're watching their relationship collapse because they've lost their daughter and there's the blame game happening and so much guilt infesting their lives. I attribute some of these really distressing moments to pretty strong acting by Ryan Reynolds and the woman playing his wife, who I believe her name is, I believe it's pronounced Marielle Ennis. There were a couple frustrations I had with this film. One, there were just some logistical things. So we're also watching from the perspective of the daughter as she is living in captivity. And for some reason, she still has perfect hair and makeup, even though she's been supposedly living in this room for years. It sort of just doesn't track. I'm assuming that she speaks the way she does in this sort of weird, poetic, ethereal way because she's been sort of abused and kept in captivity for so long with this very odd man who kidnapped her. But it makes it a little difficult to watch. Sometimes it takes me out of the story because I feel like no kid speaks in the way that this character does in the film. It's just a little distracting to me. This feels like the extremely light version of True Detective, which came out the same year. Like, the less successful version, I'd say. And I don't mean to rag on this film either, because it's still entertaining. There were just some things that didn't quite click for me. Even Ryan Reynolds, who I'm usually a big fan of, though he does a very strong acting job, I find it sort of hard to believe him as this sort of rough and tumble, like backwoods kind of country, hard manual labor working dude. It just doesn't quite work for me in the casting, though he does do a sufficiently good job acting, and even very good at many times. Though this is an interesting and still entertaining movie, I think it plays at the kidnapping theme in sort of a stereotypical way. It's a bit played on caricatures of these characters, and while there is still some interesting thriller aspect, it didn't quite sell me for this one. The story mainly focuses on solving the actual case of who took this girl Cass and how did they do it, why did they do it. The thing is, I found that a little bit less interesting than the idea of what happens after you find someone who's been in captivity for so long. I think that's why I resonate so much with Room. Well, one of the many reasons. It's a fabulous film, and we'll get there in a few weeks, is that is also an A24 film. But I think one of the most interesting things about that movie is that they deal with the aftermath. Like, how do you recover after you've been abused and kept in captivity for years? What happens to your brain? How do you interact with other people? How does that affect your life moving forward? I find that side a little more interesting, and it doesn't really go into that. It's not a bad film. It's just not one that clicked with me as much as they sometimes do.
Alright friends, tier o'clock. So first up we got Laggies. This movie was so simple, but for some reason it hit me so tremendously hard, and it's kind of become a comfort movie for me, crazy enough, so it's going right up in unearthly left this plane of existence while watching, which I know is crazy, but it's what I had to do. It's what I felt in my heart and soul. Next up, we got Revenge of the Green Dragons. This movie was very well made. It packs a punch. It is going in not my cup of tea, simply and only because I don't really resonate with gang films. It's not really my genre. I never have. It's truly is simply only because I don't really love gang movies. And last but not least, The Captive also goes in not my cup of tea. It was entertaining, but I found some things that were just frustrating to me about the film, and ultimately, you know, it just wasn't my favorite of the A24s.
And that, friends, is it for us today. I'm really glad to be back. I plan on trying to get these weekly videos out regularly. It's a little bit hard based on whatever's going on at the moment. I'm currently working on tour. I'm in Baltimore at the moment, like I said, and it can be a little crazy on the road. So we're gonna just keep on watching movies, and I want you to do the same, and I want you to tell me what you're liking right now. Tell me what the best film you've seen in the last month is, and I want to watch it with you. I want to be carted away on a story. Anyways, thanks for joining me again for another video, friends. I'm really glad to have you back, and I'm really glad to be back, and I hope to be showing up again really, really soon. Until then, keep watching those movies, friends. See you later.